Imagine a quiet night in the Vatican, where the faint golden glow from St. Peter's Square barely illuminates the ancient stone columns. No sound of cars, no murmur of crowds, only the whisper of wind weaving through the cobblestone paths, carrying the chill of a Roman winter. But in that stillness, just before midnight, 3 deliberate knocks echoed through the silence. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and in the dim light stood a Monsignor, his face trembling with a sorrow he could not conceal. "The Holy Father is calling for you," he said, his voice a hushed murmur, as if afraid to wake the world. "He's very weak, and he's asking for you by name." This was no ordinary summons, no cardinals, no cameras, no spotlight. Just a final request, spoken in the sacred silence between a pope and the one guard he trusted most. But what could have led Pope Francis, a man who stood before millions, to choose a young Swiss guard to share his final moments? And what did he say in that dimly lit room, as time itself seemed to pause? Welcome to today's story, where we'll step into a moment of profound reverence, where loyalty and faith intertwine, and where whispers carry the weight of an era. This is the story of Lance Corporal Elias Koenig, an ordinary Swiss guard chosen to become the keeper of an invisible legacy. Before we begin, drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's embark on this journey. That night, Elias was preparing for another routine shift in the Swiss Guard barracks. He was a young soldier with sharp features and eyes that held a deep, unspoken sorrow, as if the memories of his mountainous Uri homeland still weighed on his shoulders. But when those knocks sounded, his plans dissolved. Monsignor Ventresca, the Pope's longtime personal secretary, stood there, his hands trembling slightly as he repeated the summons. "The Holy Father is waiting for you." Elias asked no questions. In the Swiss Guard, you learn to obey first and wonder later. But deep within, a premonition stirred. For days, the Vatican had been hushed with anxious whispers. Pope Francis, the Pope of humility, who once washed the feet of prisoners and shunned extravagance, was fading. His public appearances had ceased. Quiet preparations had begun, but to be called by name at this hour. This was no duty, this was a farewell. He dressed with the precision of a ritual, crimson tunic buttoned meticulously, sword belt fastened, breastplate aligned perfectly over his chest. As he pulled on his white gloves, his fingers brushed against a small object tucked into the lining of his jacket, a wooden rosary, a gift from Pope Francis after one of their early private conversations. He carried it always, unseen but ever present. Monsignor Ventresca stood silently, waiting. Elias donned his plumed helmet, nodded, and they stepped into the shadowed corridor. As they crossed the courtyard, St. Peter's Square unfolded before them, vast and empty. The stone colonnades embraced only darkness, with no tourists, no flashing cameras. Only the stillness of the Vatican, as if history itself watched their passage. They entered the Apostolic Palace through a rarely used side door, reserved for visiting dignitaries. Tonight, there was no ceremony. Only the echo of their footsteps on marble floors worn smooth by centuries. The corridor led to a narrow staircase, and Elias's mind drifted back. He recalled the subtle smiles Pope Francis reserved for him after Mass, the unexpected conversations where the pontiff chose him not for confession, but for companionship. 7 years earlier, when Elias was new to the Vatican, Francis had seen the grief he carried, the loss of his family, in an avalanche in his homeland. "You pray like a man who has lost everything," Francis had said, his voice gentle as a father's. From that moment, an invisible bond formed. They didn't speak of politics or power. They spoke of pain, of faith, of the simple things the world rarely noticed. "Titles are heavy, Elias," Francis once said, "but pain is heavier still. Better to have a few true souls beside you than 1,000 who only see your robes." Now, as they approached a simple wooden door, not the grand entrance to the papal apartments, but the private chambers where Francis lived as a man, Elias felt the weight of this moment. Monsignor Ventresca touched his shoulder lightly. "He's waiting for you," he said, and opened the door. Stepping into the room, Elias entered another world. The glow from a single bedside lamp cast a soft amber light, fragile, as if it too were honoring the moment. Shadows gathered in the corners like silent witnesses. At the center, Pope Francis lay, his breathing shallow but steady. The white cassock, once filled with the vigor of a man who traveled continents, hung loosely on his frail frame. But when his gaze met Elias's, his eyes held the same clarity, untouched by time. He gestured, a faint but deliberate motion. Elias approached, his polished boots nearly silent on the wooden floor. He stopped at a respectful distance, standing at attention, though his heart urged him to kneel, to shatter the formality they had long transcended. Monsignor Ventresca withdrew quietly, the door closing with a soft click. Now, it was just them, Pope and guard, or rather, two men standing at the threshold between worlds. Francis raised a hand, pointing to a wooden chair by the window. Elias sat, placing his helmet on his knee, his eyes never leaving the Pope. Outside, the basilica bells tolled faintly, marking the passing of midnight. A new day had begun, but for the man on the bed, time moved to a different rhythm. "You came?" Francis whispered, his voice rough but warm. "Always," Elias replied, the word carrying the weight of a vow. The Pope smiled, a fragile curve of his lips. "They told me you were off duty tonight." Elias shook his head gently. "I'm never off duty for you, Holy Father." Francis closed his eyes, as if gathering strength not for his next breath, but for his next thought. "I was thinking," he said, "how strange it is that, at the end, I don't wish to see cardinals, politicians, or scholars. I only want to see you." Those words hung between them, heavier than any papal decree. Elias bowed his head. "You were never just a guard," Francis continued, each breath an effort. "You were my witness." Elias felt a wave of emotion rise, but he held it back, as a soldier holds his heart. "I failed, Elias," the Pope said, his voice breaking. "In my later years, I grew tired, I grew afraid. The world it pulled and twisted me." "You did not fail," Elias blurted, unable to restrain himself. Francis's laugh was soft, like a sigh. "Even saints fail, my son." "And I am no saint." He reached out, and Elias leaned closer so the Pope's frail hand could rest on his wrist. "I called you here not for confession," Francis whispered, "but for remembrance." Remembrance, the word fell like a stone, sinking into Elias's soul. "When no one else remembers," the Pope said, his voice clear despite its frailty, "you must. Remember what we spoke of. Remember that love without noise is still love. Service without an audience is still service." Elias closed his eyes, committing each word to memory, as if they were a final hymn. He nodded, a small but absolute gesture. Francis's hand fell away, exhausted. Outside, a night breeze stirred the curtains. In that room, a sacred covenant was sealed, invisible, but stronger than any oath Elias had sworn under the guard's flag. Time passed minutes, perhaps hours. Francis stirred, his voice faint as falling leaves. "You're still here," he said. "I promised," Elias replied. The Pope smiled, then began, as if recounting his life. "In my youth, I thought power came from being heard, from speaking loudly, from leading crowds. But it was the quiet ones who carried the world, those who listened when no one else would, those who stood firm, even without glory." He looked at Elias, his gaze piercing. "You were among them, Elias, always among them." Elias bowed his head, his heart constricted not by pain, but by the unbearable honor of these words entrusted to him. Francis continued, his voice now a mere breath. "I saw you praying alone that first day. I thought you were a statue. Then I realized, in that silence, you spoke to God more than I did in all my sermons." Elias shook his head, tears falling silently. "I'm not pure, Holy Father." "Only trying." Francis squeezed his hand faintly. "Trying is all he asks." The lamp flickered, shadows dancing on the walls like memories given form. Francis's breathing grew shallower, each inhale a final prayer. "There will come a time," he said, "when men forget why we stood guard, when tradition is mistaken for vanity, when silence is mistaken for indifference. In that hour, Elias, you must remember." He paused, summoning his last strength. "Remember that love without noise is still love. Service without an audience is still service." Elias let the tears fall, but he made no sound. He wept as a guard weeps, silent, reverent. Francis closed his eyes, and they did not reopen. His hand slipped from Elias's, resting on the linen sheet. Outside, a bell tolled once, not to mark a papal passing, but to note the hour, unaware that an era had ended. Elias knelt by the bedside, the Pope's words echoing like a sacred vow. "When no one else remembers, you must." And he would carry it not as a burden, but as a trust, a final duty requiring no sword or armor, only a heart. He remained there, motionless, until Monsignor Ventresca returned, his steps blending with the silence. Two Vatican aides appeared, beginning the ancient rites, but Elias stayed, not from duty, but from choice. When permitted to leave, he rose, not with a soldier's rigidity, but with the grace of one who had received a sacred gift. He turned, offering a final salute, not the sharp gesture of protocol, but a slow, respectful farewell between two men. Then he stepped into the corridor, carrying not a secret, but a legacy. Dawn touched the Vatican, the first light glinting on the gardens. But for Elias, this was a different dawn, marked not by the sun, but by the final whisper of a man who saw his soul. In the days that followed, the world mourned, St. Peter's Square filled with candles. But Elias began a private ritual, praying each morning with the wooden rosary, writing in his journal simple memories of Francis's laugh, the worn leather shoes he refused to replace, the strength in his hands despite his age. A week after the funeral, as cardinals gathered for the conclave, Elias stood guard at the private chapel where Francis once prayed. An elderly cardinal approached. "You're Koenig, aren't you?" "The one with him at the end." Elias nodded. "He mentioned you often," the cardinal said. "He said you understood what we often forget, that the church is not made of marble or gold, but of moments no one sees." That night, as St. Peter's bells rang to announce a new pope, Elias stood by his window, watching the square below. He touched the rosary and smiled, not with joy, but with gratitude. He had been chosen, and he would not forget. What would you do if entrusted with a great soul's final words? Would you have the strength to carry their flame when the world forgets? The story of Elias and Francis reminds us that whispers can echo louder than sermons, and silent loyalty can shape an era. If this story moved you, share it, and leave your thoughts below. We read every comment and cherish every perspective. Hit subscribe to join us for more profound journeys. We'll see you next time in another story of faith, loyalty, and the sacred.